He thought humiliating her would be entertaining, but in less than 10 seconds, he would realize he had completely misread the room. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, and if you believe respect should never be judged by appearance, make sure to like and subscribe because these stories matter. Now, back to Hannah Brooks. The dojo sat on the edge of a quiet suburban street just outside Columbus, Ohio, its glass doors reflecting the late afternoon sun like polished steel. Inside, the air carried a mix of leather, sweat, and discipline, the steady thud of training pads echoing across the polished wooden floor. It was the kind of place where reputations were built slowly and broken even faster, where every movement was watched and every mistake remembered. And at the center of it all stood Derek Cole, a third-degree black belt with a reputation that stretched far beyond the city limits. Students admired him, instructors respected him, and newcomers learned quickly that Derek wasn't someone you challenged lightly. That afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the high windows, the rhythm of training paused for just a moment when the door creaked open. Hannah Brooks stepped inside quietly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the space. She wore a plain gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and carried a small duffel bag over her shoulder. Nothing about her appearance suggested experience, skill, or anything remotely impressive. In fact, to most of the students glancing her way, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. A few exchanged quick smirks. One student nudged another, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Beginner class is on Tuesdays. A low ripple of laughter followed, subtle but unmistakable. Hannah didn't react. She simply stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room once, calm and steady, before settling near the edge of the mat. Derek noticed her immediately. He always did. Years of training had sharpened his awareness, but what caught his attention wasn't her presence, it was what he assumed about it. He walked over slowly, rolling his shoulders with relaxed confidence, the kind that came from never being questioned. "You lost?" he asked, his tone light but edged with amusement. The nearby students leaned in slightly, sensing something was about to happen. Hannah shook her head gently. "No," she said, her voice quiet, almost too soft for the room. Derek let out a short laugh, glancing at the others as if inviting them in on the moment. "This isn't a fitness class," he added, gesturing toward the training floor. "We take things seriously here." Another chuckle moved through the group. The atmosphere shifted, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably dismissive. Hannah stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged. No defense, no explanation, just stillness. And somehow, that stillness made the room feel different, though no one could quite explain why. Derek tilted his head slightly, studying her for a second longer before smirking. "Tell you what," he said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see what you can do." The words hung in the air like a challenge disguised as entertainment. A few students stepped back, forming a loose circle without being told. Phones lowered. Conversation stopped. The room began to quiet on its own, anticipation replacing amusement. Hannah didn't move right away. For a brief moment, everything slowed, the distant hum of traffic outside, the faint creak of the wooden floor, even the steady breathing of the students around her. Then she looked up, meeting Derek's eyes for the first time. Calm, steady, unshaken. And something about that look, something subtle and almost invisible, made the air feel just a little heavier. The room went silent. For a moment, Derek did not move, not because he was uncertain, but because he was enjoying the attention. The circle around them tightened slightly as students shifted their weight, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the center of the mat. This was familiar territory for him, a stage he had stood on many times before. He thrived in these moments, where confidence alone seemed enough to win before anything even began. He took a slow step forward, rolling his neck once, as if loosening up for something routine, something predictable. Hannah remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her hands still at her sides. No stance, no visible preparation, just quiet presence. Derek raised an eyebrow, a faint smile forming again. "You can take a second if you need it," he said casually, his voice carrying across the room. "No rush." A few students chuckled softly, though the laughter was thinner now, less certain than before. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. "Hannah," did not respond. Instead, she took a single step onto the mat, her sneakers making a soft sound against the wood before she slipped them off and placed them neatly to the side. The small, deliberate action drew more attention than any dramatic gesture could have. It was careful, intentional, almost practiced. Derek noticed it too, though he dismissed the thought as quickly as it appeared. He had seen beginners try to act composed before. It never changed the outcome. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Let us keep this simple." His tone suggested control, authority, and a hint of performance, as if he were not just addressing Hannah, but everyone watching. He shifted his stance slightly, demonstrating balance, precision, and years of training in a way that felt almost theatrical. Several students nodded, reassured by the familiar display. This was what they expected. This was how it always went. Hannah lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes without hesitation. There was no challenge in her expression, no attempt to prove anything, and that absence itself created a kind of tension that Derek could not quite place. He took another step closer, testing the space between them, expecting some reaction, a flinch, a defensive posture, anything that would confirm his assumption. But nothing came. The distance closed, and still, she did not move. The air seemed to thicken, the quiet stretching longer than anyone anticipated. One of the students near the back shifted uncomfortably, the sound of fabric brushing breaking the silence for just a second before it settled again. Derek exhaled slowly, a small sign of impatience creeping in. He was used to controlling the pace, dictating the rhythm. This stillness disrupted that control in a way he did not like. "You are going to want to pay attention," he said, lowering his voice slightly now, the humor fading into something more focused. "This is where most people get overwhelmed." But even as he spoke, there was a flicker, barely noticeable, a moment where his certainty hesitated. Hannah's eyes did not waver. They were steady, clear, and impossibly calm, as if she had already seen how this would end. No one in the room said a word. The earlier smirks had disappeared. The casual whispers had stopped. What remained was a silence filled with anticipation, a sense that whatever was about to happen would not follow the script everyone expected. And for the first time since she walked through the door, Derek felt it too. Not fear, not yet, but something unfamiliar pressing quietly against his confidence, like a question he did not know how to answer. The moment stretched just long enough for doubt to begin forming in the minds of those watching, but Derek refused to let it take hold. He shifted his weight forward with controlled precision, initiating movement not out of necessity, but to reclaim the rhythm he was used to commanding. His steps were measured, confident, the kind that came from years of repetition and recognition. To anyone observing, it looked clean, disciplined, exactly what they expected from someone of his rank. A few students nodded subtly, reassured by the familiar pattern returning to the room. This was how it was supposed to go. This was how it always went. Hannah, however, did not mirror his movement. She did not retreat, did not brace, did not react in any visible way. Instead, she adjusted her stance by a fraction, so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the absolute stillness surrounding them. Her breathing remained even, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze fixed but not aggressive. It was not the posture of someone trying to prove something. It was the posture of someone who did not need to. Derek closed the distance further, expecting the natural response that always followed, hesitation, imbalance, a tell that revealed inexperience. But again, nothing came. No flinch, no shift, no sign of uncertainty. The silence deepened, no longer filled with anticipation, but with something closer to confusion. One of the younger students near the wall leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced with curiosity. He could not explain it, but something about Hannah's composure did not match the assumptions they had all made. Derek noticed the change in the room, the way attention was no longer centered on him alone. It irritated him more than he expected. He moved again, this time with a sharper intent, guiding the interaction forward, demonstrating control, guiding space, and timing the way he had been taught. But in that same instant, something subtle shifted. Hannah responded, not with force, not with speed that looked dramatic, but with precision so quiet it almost blended into the motion itself. A small adjustment, a redirection, a step placed exactly where it needed to be. It happened so smoothly that for a fraction of a second, It was unclear who had actually led the movement. Derek felt it before he fully understood it. A brief loss of alignment, a disruption so slight that most would not notice, but enough to interrupt the flow he relied on. His expression changed, just for a moment. The confidence did not disappear, but it faltered, interrupted by something unfamiliar. He reset quickly, stepping back half a foot, recalibrating, reminding himself that this was still under his control. Across from him, Hannah remained steady, her posture unchanged, her breathing the same, her eyes calm. She had not rushed. She had not reacted emotionally. She had simply moved at the exact right moment. The room held its breath. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the faint sounds from outside seemed to fade as attention narrowed completely to the space between them. Derek straightened slightly, masking the hesitation with a small nod, as if acknowledging something minor, something not worth mentioning. But the atmosphere had already changed. The earlier amusement was gone. The quiet now carried weight. And somewhere in that silence, the first realization began to form, not fully understood, not yet spoken, but impossible to ignore, that this was no longer a demonstration, and that whatever came next would not follow any expectation they had walked in with. The shift was no longer subtle. Derek felt it settle into the room like pressure before a storm, quiet but undeniable. He had spent years reading opponents, predicting movement, controlling outcomes before they unfolded, but what stood in front of him now did not follow the patterns he knew. Still, pride is a powerful thing, and Derek was not the kind of man who stepped back once eyes were on him. He adjusted his stance again, this time more deliberate, more focused, no longer performing for the room, but trying to reassert control over something that had quietly slipped out of his grasp. His breathing slowed, his gaze sharpened, and for the first time since Hannah walked through the door, he took her seriously. Around them, the students felt it too. The shift from entertainment to something else, something heavier. No one smiled now. No one whispered. The earlier assumptions had dissolved, replaced by a tension that made even the smallest movements feel amplified. Hannah stood exactly as before, grounded, calm, unshaken. She did not advance. She did not retreat. She simply waited, as if she understood something the rest of the room had not yet caught up to. Derek moved again, but this time there was no theatrics, no attempt to impress. It was direct, controlled, intentional. A demonstration of skill rather than dominance. And for a brief second, it seemed like the balance might return, like the moment of disruption had passed. But then it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just precisely. Hannah shifted, a single step, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. Her movement did not clash with his, it redirected it, guided it, as if she had known exactly what he would do before he did it. Derek felt his footing change, not enough to fall, but enough to break the rhythm he depended on. His body adjusted instinctively, but his timing was no longer his own. The control he had built over years of training slipped through his fingers in a matter of seconds, replaced by something unfamiliar, something he could not anticipate. The room reacted before anyone spoke. A collective stillness, deeper than before, heavier. One student near the front took a half step back without realizing it. Another lowered his arms slowly, eyes fixed, trying to understand what he was seeing. Derek stepped away, just enough to reset, but this time there was no smirk, no easy confidence to fall back on. His jaw tightened slightly, his mind working faster now, recalculating, searching for an explanation that made sense. Across from him, Hannah remained unchanged. No sign of effort. No sign of tension. Just quiet control. She had not rushed. She had not reacted emotionally. She had simply allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Derek exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried weight. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the assumptions he had made, but at the way she held herself, the way she moved without waste, without hesitation. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, not defeat, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when certainty is replaced with truth. The room did not move. No one broke the silence. Because everyone felt it now, the same realization forming at the same time, that this was no longer his stage, and whatever happened next would not belong to him. The realization settled fully now, not just in Derek, but in every person standing around the mat. What had started as a moment of casual amusement had transformed into something none of them could ignore. Derek stood still for a second longer than he intended, his mind moving quickly, trying to regain the structure he had always relied on. He had faced skilled opponents before, people faster, stronger, more experienced, but this was different. This was not about speed or strength. This was control, quiet and precise, the kind that did not need to announce itself. He straightened his posture, drawing in a slow breath, choosing carefully how to move next. This time, there was no performance left in him, only focus. He stepped forward again, measured and deliberate, attempting to re-establish his timing, to bring the interaction back into something he understood. But the moment he committed, Hannah moved. Not fast in the way that draws attention, but exact in a way that leaves no room for correction. A slight shift of her weight, a subtle turn of her shoulders, and suddenly Derek found himself guided rather than leading, redirected without resistance, his balance quietly taken from him without force. It happened so smoothly that for a split second, it did not even register as a mistake, only as something that no longer belonged to him. His foot adjusted, searching for stability, but the rhythm was gone. The control was gone. And then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. Derek stopped, his movement halted not by impact, but by the realization that continuing would only make it clearer. He stood there, steady but no longer certain, his eyes lifting to meet Hannah's. She had already stepped back, returning to that same calm, grounded posture, as if nothing significant had occurred. No triumph, no display, just stillness. The room did not react immediately. It was as if everyone needed a second to process what they had just witnessed. Then the silence deepened, heavier than before, filled with something that replaced doubt entirely. Understanding. One student near the edge of the circle exhaled quietly, not even realizing he had been holding his breath. Another shook his head slightly, eyes still locked on Hannah, trying to reconcile what he had assumed with what he had just seen. Derek swallowed once. A small, almost invisible motion, but it carried weight. He looked around briefly, noticing the change in every face, the absence of amusement, the presence of something closer to respect. When his gaze returned to Hannah, it was different now. There was no trace of the earlier smirk, no hint of dismissal, only recognition. "Where did you train?" he asked, his voice lower, steadier, stripped of everything it carried before. Hannah paused for a moment, as if considering whether the question mattered. Then she gave a small, simple answer. "Different places," she said. Nothing more. No explanation. No need to prove anything further. Derek nodded slowly, absorbing the response, understanding more from what was not said than what was. The room remained silent, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was respectful. No one moved to break it. No one rushed to speak. Because in that moment, every person there understood something they had missed when she first walked through the door. Skill does not announce itself. It does not need attention. It reveals itself only when necessary. And as Hannah reached down to pick up her sneakers, placing them back on with the same quiet care she had shown when she entered, the lesson settled fully into the room. Not loud, not forced, just undeniable. The sound of Hannah tying her laces echoed softly against the wooden floor, a small, ordinary action that somehow carried more weight than anything that had just happened. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one broke the moment with nervous laughter or forced conversation. The room held its stillness, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of recognition. Derek remained where he was, his posture upright, but no longer projecting authority the way he had before. Instead, he stood with a kind of quiet reflection, as if replaying the last few seconds in his mind, searching for the exact moment everything shifted beyond his control. He had built his reputation on discipline, on consistency, on being the one others looked to for guidance. And now, in front of his own students, that foundation had been challenged, not with aggression, not with force, but with something far more difficult to confront. Precision, control, humility. He let out a slow breath, then stepped forward, not to reassert dominance, but to close the distance in a way that felt different from before. The circle around them widened slightly, students instinctively making space, not out of fear, but out of respect for what they had just witnessed. Derek stopped a few feet from Hannah, his hands relaxed at his sides. For a moment, he said nothing. The pause was not awkward. It was necessary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier amusement, none of the condescension. "I misjudged you," he said simply. The words were not loud, but they carried clearly through the room. A few students exchanged quick glances, surprised not by the statement itself, but by how openly it was said. Hannah looked up at him, her expression unchanged, calm as ever. She did not respond right away. She did not rush to accept the apology or dismiss it. She simply listened. Derek nodded once, as if acknowledging something to himself as much as to her. "That is on me," he added. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to explain or justify what had happened earlier. Just ownership. And in a space built on discipline, that mattered more than any title or rank. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again, this time softer, lighter, but still grounded in the lesson that had just unfolded. One of the younger students stepped forward slightly, curiosity replacing hesitation. "How long have you been training?" he asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. Hannah glanced at him briefly, then back at Derek, before answering. "Long enough," she said quietly. The answer was simple, almost understated, but it carried everything it needed to. It was not about years. It was not about titles. It was about experience that did not need validation. A faint smile appeared on Derek's face, not the confident smirk from before, but something more genuine, more grounded. "If you ever feel like sharing more," he said, "this place could learn from you." The words landed differently than anything he had said earlier. They were not an invitation for entertainment. They were an acknowledgement of value. Hannah considered him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Nothing more. No promises. No declarations. Just quiet acknowledgement. And somehow that was enough. The students began to shift again, not back into their previous rhythm, but into something slightly changed. Conversations would come later. Questions would follow. But for now, the room held on to the moment just a little longer. Because what they had seen was not just skill. It was a reminder that confidence without humility is fragile, that appearances can mislead even the most experienced, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the deepest understanding of all. And as Hannah picked up her bag and stepped toward the door, the sound of her footsteps fading into the evening light, no one tried to stop her. Because some lessons are not meant to be held on to. They are meant to stay exactly where they happen, leaving behind something far more valuable than words. The door closed softly behind Hannah, the faint click echoing longer than it should have, as if the room itself was reluctant to let the moment end. For a few seconds, no one moved. The evening light filtered through the tall windows, stretching across the floor where she had just stood, leaving behind an empty space that somehow felt fuller than before. Derek remained near the center of the mat, his gaze fixed on the spot where everything had shifted. The energy in the room had changed, and he knew it was not something that could simply be reset with a command or a routine. One of the senior students cleared his throat quietly, breaking the silence just enough to bring everyone back. "Coach," he asked, uncertain, as if waiting for direction. Derek blinked once, the word pulling him back into the present. He looked around at his students, really looked this time, seeing not just their technique or their form, but the questions in their eyes, the way their understanding of the space had shifted. For years, he had taught them to project confidence, to control situations, to trust their training. But what they had just witnessed added something that had never been spoken out loud. Humility. He stepped forward slowly, the sound of his bare feet against the wood grounding him. "Pair up," he said, his voice steady, but softer than usual. The instruction was simple, familiar, but it carried a different weight now. Students moved into position, though the usual chatter was absent. They glanced at one another, some exchanging quiet looks, as if silently acknowledging that what they had just seen would stay with them longer than any drill. As the room began to shift back into motion, Derek walked to the edge of the mat, folding his arms, loosely observing. But his focus was not on correcting form or calling out mistakes. Instead, he watched how they moved, how they approached each other, whether they carried the same assumptions they had earlier. One pair hesitated before starting, both students adjusting their stance with more care than before. Another slowed their movements, no longer rushing to demonstrate skill, but paying attention, really paying attention. Derek noticed it all. The lesson had already taken root. Near the back, The younger student who had spoken earlier stood still for a moment longer than the others. He looked toward the door, then back at his partner. "You think she will come back?" he asked quietly. His partner shrugged, but his eyes carried the same curiosity. Derek heard the question, though he did not respond immediately. He followed their gaze to the door, then let it drift back across the room. "If she does," he said after a moment, "we will be ready to learn." The words settled into the space with a quiet certainty. Not as a command, not as a promise, but as a shift in perspective. Training resumed, the familiar rhythm returning, but it was not the same rhythm as before. There was a pause in each movement now, a moment of awareness that had not existed earlier. No one laughed as loudly. No one dismissed as quickly. The room had not lost its discipline. It had gained depth. And as the sun dipped lower outside, casting longer shadows across the mat, Derek remained still for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful, grounded in something that could not be taught through drills or ranks. Because sometimes, the most important lessons do not come from the person leading the room. They come from the one no one thought to notice, until it was too late to ignore. And long after the session ended, after the students had left and the lights dimmed, that quiet realization stayed behind, lingering in the empty space where everything had changed. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of early light that softened everything it touched, but inside the dojo, the atmosphere still carried the weight of the night before. Derek stood alone near the center of the mat, the building silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic waking up beyond the glass doors. He had arrived. Earlier than usual, something he had not done in years. Not out of obligation, but because his mind had not settled. The events of the previous evening replayed in fragments, not dramatic, not loud, but precise. Every movement, every moment of stillness, every assumption he had made before he even spoke. He walked slowly across the mat, retracing the space where it had all unfolded, his steps measured, thoughtful. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about teaching. He was thinking about learning. When the first students began to arrive, they noticed the difference immediately. There was no music playing, no casual warm-up chatter, no easy smiles from Derek as he greeted them. Instead, there was a quiet focus, something grounded and deliberate. They stepped onto the mat more carefully, their voices lower, as if the room itself demanded a different kind of respect. One by one, they gathered, exchanging brief glances, the memory of the previous session still fresh in their minds. No one joked about it. No one exaggerated what they had seen. They did not need to. It had been clear enough. Derek waited until everyone was in position before speaking. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, letting the silence settle before he began. "Yesterday," he said, his tone calm, steady, "you all saw something important." He paused, not for effect, but to make sure the words had space to land. Several students nodded slightly, their attention fixed on him. "Skill is not always loud," he continued. "It does not always look the way you expect, and it does not care what you assume." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that none of his usual instructions had. This was not about technique. This was about perspective. He looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. "From now on," he added, "you treat every person who steps onto this mat the same way. With attention, with respect. No exceptions." There was no challenge in his tone, no need to enforce the statement. The lesson had already been learned. The students shifted slightly, their posture more attentive than usual, their focus sharper. Training began, but it unfolded differently. Movements were slower, more intentional. Partners watched each other more closely, not searching for mistakes, but for understanding. The energy in the room was no longer about proving anything. It was about learning something deeper. As the session progressed, Derek observed quietly, his usual corrections replaced by small adjustments, subtle guidance. He was not trying to control the room the way he once had. He was allowing it to grow. Near the end of the session, the door opened again. The sound was soft, but every head turned instantly. Conversation stopped. Movement paused. The room held its breath without being told to. Hannah stepped inside, just as quietly as she had the day before, her presence unchanged, her expression calm. For a brief second, no one moved. Then Derek stepped forward, not with the confidence of someone in control, but with the clarity of someone who understood what mattered now. He nodded once, simple and direct. No introduction. No announcement. Just acknowledgement. And this time, no one laughed. No one whispered. The room did not question why she was there. It simply made space. Hannah stepped fully onto the mat, setting her bag gently by the wall, the same quiet presence filling the room without effort. No one looked away this time. No one underestimated. The students adjusted their positions instinctively, giving her space not out of uncertainty, but out of respect that had already been earned. Derek gestured toward the center of the mat, a simple motion that carried a new kind of meaning. This was no longer a stage for demonstration. It was a space for understanding. Hannah walked forward, her steps even, unhurried, as if she had done this 1,000 times before in rooms far louder, far more demanding than this one. She stopped at the center, turning slightly to face the group rather than Derek, her gaze moving across them with calm awareness. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not tense. It was focused. A room ready to listen. Derek stepped back, giving her the space without needing to announce it. That alone told everyone everything had changed. Hannah raised one hand slightly, not to command attention, but to begin. Most people, she said, her voice steady and clear, think skill is about reacting faster than the person in front of you. She paused, letting the words settle. It is not. The students leaned in, not physically, but mentally, their attention sharpening. It is about understanding before anything happens, she continued. Position, balance, intention. As she spoke, she demonstrated small movements, subtle shifts of her weight, the placement of her feet, the alignment of her shoulders. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked impressive at first glance. But as she repeated the motions, slower, clearer, the difference became visible. The precision, the control. One student blinked, realizing that what he had always rushed through was actually the foundation of everything. Another adjusted his stance unconsciously, mirroring her without being told. Derek watched from the side, arms relaxed, his focus not on correcting, but on observing how quickly the room absorbed what she offered. This was not instruction driven by authority. It was understanding shared through experience. Hannah stepped back slightly, nodding toward one of the students near the front. Try, she said simply. The student hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, moving carefully, applying what he had just seen rather than what he had been taught before. The difference was immediate. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but clear. Hannah nodded once, acknowledging the effort, then looked across the room again. No praise, no critique, just quiet confirmation. And that was enough. The session continued like that, not as a performance, not as a challenge, but as a steady unfolding of something deeper than technique. Movements became more intentional. Reactions slowed into understanding. The room transformed, not because someone demanded it, but because they had all seen what happened when assumptions replaced awareness. As the morning light grew brighter, filling the dojo with a soft, steady glow, the lesson settled into every corner of the space. Not loud, not forced, just present. And when the session finally came to a close, no one rushed to leave. No one spoke immediately. They simply stood there for a moment longer, holding on to something they knew would stay with them long after they stepped outside. Derek stepped forward once more, not to lead, but to stand beside Hannah, his posture equal, his expression grounded. He looked at the students, then back at her, and gave a small nod. Not as recognition of rank, but as recognition of truth. And in that quiet room, filled with understanding rather than noise, one thing became clear without needing to be said. Respect is not given by titles, appearances, or assumptions. It is revealed through discipline, through humility, and through the moments when the world expects one thing and witnesses something entirely different.